It is the Breer Report for May the 7th. We are going to dive in on your questions. We do have some news this morning with George Pickens being traded from Pittsburgh to Dallas. We will address it here with one of your questions. George Pickens and a 2027 sixth-round pick going to the Cowboys in exchange for a 2026 third-rounder and a 2027 fifth-rounder. As always, we're answering a lot of your questions on the website at themmqb.com. So we've got more answers to more questions there. If you're interested in what you hear here, be sure to go and read what we've got up on the website. Our first question for this week comes from Brandon Laurie. That's at Brandon is right. From the outside, it looked like George Pickens was a problem for Pittsburgh, but did you ever get the sense he was an issue for the Steelers inside the locker room? A question of if the perception is in fact reality. And the answer, Brandon, I would say is yes. That things weren't always perfect between the Steelers and George Pickens. Now, one thing for background that you should know here is that Mike Tomlin has always been the best at managing personalities and being able to work with whoever the personnel department hands him. So whether it's a guy with a great personality, a tough personality, whether it's an energetic guy, a guy who needs a kick in the ass, he's always been great at figuring out what his players need and how to manage all of them. So I always cast a skeptical eye to the player that no longer works in Pittsburgh. And we've seen it the last few years, the receiver position in particular. They know when to cut bait on guys. And this applies to guys like Martavius Bryant, Juju Smith-Schuster, Chase Claypool, certainly, Antonio Brown, most famously. And so one of the reasons they've been able to build up the roster that they've been able to build up over the years, and they've generally been one of the more talented teams in football, is because they can cast a wider net, because Mike Tomlin doesn't need a certain personality to work with. He can work with all kinds of people. He's one of the best people person in the league. And again, that shows up in the way that they're able to procure talent. So that's number one. That's an important background piece to all of this. Now, as for Pickens specifically, I don't think that this is a bad guy. I think, in fact, most Steelers people would tell you they think he's a good-hearted guy. But it does take a lot of work to keep the train on the tracks. And that's something that the Steelers experienced over the last 3 years. They wouldn't be walking away from George Pickens if that wasn't the case. And really what it comes down to, and what it has come down to over the years, is George Pickens dealing with his frustration, his consistency on the field. Sometimes his frustration with the direction of the offense or his role in it has led to inconsistency on the field in route running or drops. This is a guy who is supremely talented. And on talent alone, if he was healthy, and he wasn't healthy going into the draft, but if he was healthy, he didn't have any character issues, like, this is a guy who would have been a top 5 pick. Like, is that sort of talent? In fact, if you want to go back 5 or 6 years, when we were doing predictions on what was going to happen in the next decade at the start of this decade, I think I picked George Pickens to be the leading receiver for the decade. It was something like that, because he was that big a talent at the University of Georgia. But this sort of stuff has always held him back. So now the question for the Cowboys becomes, can we bring him in and manage his personality? And it's going to be up to a lot of people. Brian Schottenheimer, first and foremost, is a first-year head coach, building the right sort of culture that's going to be able to work with a guy like this. And then, I think, you go down to the assistant coaches and then the people in the receiver room. What's his relationship going to be like with CeeDee Lamb, especially in a year where George Pickens is playing for a new contract, is playing for life-changing money. So it's going to be easy for everybody to get along in May and June. In October, November, what happens if you go through 3 or 4 weeks where he catches a total of 10 balls? Is that going to be a problem? These are the sorts of things you got to keep an eye on. Like, again, I don't think George Pickens is a bad-hearted guy, but these are things that have followed him, and it's why he's available right now. It's why he hasn't been paid to his talent. It's why he wasn't drafted in the first place to his talent. So, again, this is something that I think you go in with an open mind and how this is going to turn out in Dallas, but you have the knowledge of everything that's happened before and what it's going to take, again, to keep that train on the tracks. All right, question number 2 is from Ronnie. That's at Trey40. If you could predict the Cleveland Browns quarterback depth chart to start the season, what would it be? I would say right now, the quarterback depth chart would be Joe Flacco as the starter. It would be Kenny Pickett as the backup. And I believe it will be Dylan Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders on the roster. They're going to keep 4 quarterbacks in this scenario. And both those guys have pretty consistent game day inactives. I do think the spring is more important for the Browns than it is for other teams, and in particular at the quarterback position, because there are only so many reps to go around once you get to the summer. You're going to have to figure out who your best quarterback is. You also got to build an offense for whoever that quarterback's going to be and protect and prepare the other 10 guys in that huddle for the regular season, which means getting them ready to play with a certain quarterback. So I think over the next 5 or 6 weeks, what you're hoping for, if you're Kevin Stefanski, their new offensive coordinator, Tommy Rees, is that things begin to clarify. And so does Joe Flacco look better than Kenny Pickett? How do Shedeur Sanders and Dylan Gabriel compete with one another? Both those guys played a lot of football in college, so those guys should be ready to make the transition from college to pro, just on the sheer number of starts they made in college and the sheer number of balls they threw in college. So, I see this as a really interesting 5 or 6 week period where you're going to have to figure out some sort of working pecking order so you can be more efficient when it comes to the summer. And another interesting point here is the level of investment in the veteran quarterbacks. The guarantees for Joe Flacco and Kenny Pickett are almost identical. So the penalty from walking away from either guy is virtually the same, which means both those guys are on an even playing field. And if you'd rather not keep 4 quarterbacks, like then it becomes not only, are Shedeur Sanders or Dylan Gabriel on some off chance ready to be the starter, or one of those guys ready to be the backup. If one of those guys is ready to be the backup, does that give you the flexibility to walk away from either Kenny Pickett or Joe Flacco? So there's a lot of things to work through here. I mean, do you consider generally third round picks have made the team, right? Like generally you don't cut a third round pick out of camp. However, if Shedeur Sanders looks better than Dylan Gabriel, do you consider walking away from Dylan Gabriel if you feel the need to keep both veterans? There are just lots of questions that you're going to need clarification for between now and the final cut down in August. And you need to start laying the groundwork for that now. So it'll be interesting to see the way that all of that plays out. But I think the most likely scenario would be Flacco as a starter, Pickett as the backup, and then the 2 rookies probably on the 53-man roster as game day inactives. But again, do I think that they would love for a scenario where one of the rookies plays well enough to show that they can be the backup and maybe they can let go of one of the veterans so they can save the roster spot? I think that's certainly something they would think about. Finally, question number 3 from 007, our final question for this week. In your opinion, what would be a realistic expectation for J.J. McCarthy in his first year starting? Are the Vikings confident enough in his abilities that they believe they can go on a deep playoff run with him in his first year, given how talented the roster is? I looked through some history to try to find an example of what I think would be a good year and maybe something that would be comparable. And the one I came up with, if you want a roaring success, like what, if you're the Vikings, if you're JJ McCarthy, you're shooting for, is actually Deshaun Watson in 2018. And I think that example works because if you look at it, they went through a period early in his rookie year when Deshaun Watson showed a lot of promise. Now, J.J. McCarthy didn't get to the season, but Watson showed promise in camp. Then he winds up starting for a little while, didn't start at the opener, but started in week 2, and then he gets hurt. And so he was dealing with some of the same things J.J. McCarthy was dealing with, and that you're trying to continue developing as a quarterback, but you've got to do it without having the physical capability of getting out there and practicing for the bulk of your rookie year. And that, to me, sort of it gives you an idea of okay, where could we be going forward? Where was Deshaun in Houston? Well, Deshaun came back and threw for 4,000 yards, had 26 touchdowns against 9 interceptions. Like McCarthy, he had a good situation. He had a true number 1 receiver in his prime in DeAndre Hopkins. He had a really good offensive line. Dwayne Brown was still the left tackle there. They had a lot of things going for them. And that was a really, really good team. And so that Texans team winds up making the playoffs in 2018. And really they were in a position to, they were in a position going forward where you looked at and said, this is a team that can be a great team going forward, in part because Deshaun Watson is their quarterback coming out of the 2018 season. And then in 19, if you remember, that was sort of where the Bill O'Brien era seemed like it was going up and then, went down, was In 2019, they made it to the divisional playoffs, and they had a big lead on the Chiefs in the divisional playoffs. And then Patrick Mahomes, Kansas City, put their foot on the gas. It's almost like they haven't looked back since, in winning the second half going away. But that's the sort of example, I think. Like what think you'd be looking at would be J.J. McCarthy having this sort of second year in Minnesota that Deshaun Watson had in Houston, which wasn't perfect, but was a really good team around him, an offensive-minded head coach, and a team that looked like it was on the rise. So I don't think that's setting expectations too high, but right around 4,000 yards, 26 touchdowns, 9 picks, that seems like a reasonable idea based on what's around J.J. McCarthy for him to shoot for. And if he does hit those numbers, which I believe he can, then I think we're talking about the Vikings feeling really, really good about where they are as a football team going into 2026. Appreciate you guys coming out. Again, please be sure to check out the print mailbag on the mmqb.com. We are going to continue forward. More Breer reports coming to you. I know it's a little slower now. Free agencies in the books, drafts in the books. We're into OTAs, so it's a little bit of a slower time in the calendar. But we're going to continue bringing you content from now until the NFL break, which comes in the middle of June. So be sure to continue checking us out. Subscribe on YouTube. We've got a podcast going up with our betting expert today, too. So be sure to check that out as well.